Okay, so hello, classics people. Classics 1110, classical cultures. We're back with our second lecture, and today we're going to be talking about Aristophanes' clouds. Before we get to Aristophanes, there are a few things that I want to touch on, excuse me, because I received multiple emails from students about these subjects. One of them is the order of the readings as they relate to the lectures. The basic point is I just want you to keep sticking to the syllabus. We're doing Aristophanes today. Let me get the syllabus out here. Next is Euripides, Bacchae. Then we're going to do some Plato. Again, we're going to skip the second midterm, and then we'll get into the Roman stuff, Virgil and Ovid and Seneca. So just stay to the schedule. The relationship of the lectures that you're watching online to the reading assignment on the syllabus is the same as it would have been on campus, right? You just stick to the syllabus. Don't worry about, don't worry about, let me rephrase, you will get more out of the lectures if you have already read the work than if you try to watch the lectures and then try to sorry to use this phrase, but reverse engineer back into the work, because it's not gonna be effective for you. So read the works first, and then watch the lectures second. The lectures will stay up for a week. After a week, I will pull the lecture down. And the reason for that is because I want you to stay on pace with the lectures and not try to cram everything in all at once at the end of the semester. So it's part of my job, and it's part of your job. So stay on pace with the readings. It'll give you something to do. You can close a door on your little brother or sister and say, I have work to do. And then do your work. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. What else? I will be emailing the link out to the lecture as I did last time via the portal. Whatever's in the portal is where I send the email to. So if you don't have that up to date, that's on you. I already warned you about that. So there's that, but I'll also be posting a link on Blackboard, which I opened today. I got a lot of emails about Blackboard and the course not being open. You should be aware that Blackboard and CUNY First were both shut down for several days because they couldn't handle, I guess, the traffic that they were getting. I don't know what exactly the reason is. Don't tell me. If you have questions, again, send them to me by my Brooklyn College email. So that's jpletcher@brooklyn.cuny.edu. jpletcher@brooklyn.cuny.edu. It's at the top of the syllabus. That's where I'll get emails. That's where I'll be able to look at things. Do not email me through Gmail or send messages through the YouTube, because I'm just not looking at that. I'm going to just be looking at my email, and those are the emails that I'll take seriously. And I think that's about it for right now. Yeah, so let's get down to it. Let's get down to Euripides, keep looking forward to Euripides because I love them so much. Let's get down to Aristophanes and the clouds. Okay, so we will start with Aristophanes. Aristophanes is how his name is said. Aristophanes. He was born probably at some point in the middle of the 450s and died probably at some point in the middle of the 380s. Again, with ancient testimonia, it's sometimes difficult to tell, and it's also difficult to know what to rely on. So I think we can use 350, or I'm sorry, excuse me, 450 to 380 as a useful context for the career of Aristophanes. We do have better evidence for the years his plays were produced. For example, The Clouds was probably, well, there's two versions of The Clouds, right? There's the one that was first produced in probably 424 or 425, and it didn't win. And then there's the version that we read for in our class, because it's the version that survives. The original version doesn't survive. That he wrote some years later, maybe as much as a decade later, but certainly 6, 7, 8, 9 years later, where we know it's a revised version because in the chorus he has the chorus leader step out and say, well, you didn't award this play first prize first time, so since we, and it's the chorus speaking, since we, the Clouds, are not happy with that, we're going to pee on your head as you leave, i.e. we're going to rain on you. So that's a pretty giveaway little token right there. So Aristophanes, I'm not going to get too much into Aristophanes' biography because, frankly, there isn't too much to be said about it because there isn't too much to be definitively known about it. He was definitely grew up in privilege. Definitely was extremely well educated. Definitely had the free time on his hands to go around Athens and observe things and note who was who. So one of the things that we talk about Aristophanes, is we're talking about comedy. So we did 2 tragedies so far. We did comedy, right? I'm not sure how long I need to leave this up here for. Doubt very long. So comedy, as opposed to tragedy, we've already done 2 tragedies. We're going to do a third one. So we did Prometheus Bound, and we did Oedipus the King, and today we're going to do The Clouds. So we did 2 tragedies. Now we're going to go to comedy, and then we're going to go to Euripides, whose writing is a bit different. I'll talk about him more this weekend when we do the next lecture. So tragedy, now comedy. They're the same and they're different. They're the same in the sense that they both are tackling political ideas. Tragedy tends to tackle political ideas that are larger than any individual. So as we talked about when we looked at Prometheus Bound, it's ideas of justice and Zeus's tyrannos and Prometheus' willful disobeying. But these things they're cosmic in scope, right? And then we looked at Sophocles' Oedipus the King. We looked at Apollo, and Apollo as being the truth teller, the voice of Zeus who gives us law and order on earth. But again, these are concepts that are bigger than any one individual. When we turn to comedy, Athenian comedy, or when I say Athenian comedy, what I really mean is Aristophanes, because nobody else's comedy survives from this time period. So we only have Aristophanes comedies. Aristophanes is very specific. He names names. And of course, we can tell this right away in The Clouds because of the use of the character of Socrates. I'm just going to write his name down. I won't hold it up right now. I will come back to it. I'm just writing it down so I don't forget to come back to it, though I don't know how I could in talking about The Clouds. So, so there the things. So Aristophanes' comedy. I'll just say this briefly. They're raunchy. The jokes have to do with sex. They have to do with pooping and peeing and farting and barfing. That's what we call low comedy, right? So they're very low. There's a very low comic aspect to things, and also too you could throw into that mix. They're very slapstick. Um, there's lots of physical comedy happening on the stage. People running into each other, people hitting each other, that kind of thing, like sort of Three Stooges ish sort of thing. Um, if anybody gets that reference. But at the same time, they're dealing with very high ideas. So they're looking at Aristophanes is using a very low comedy approach. Um, this is what we call scatology. Scatology. What scatology or scatological humor means is having to do with bodily functions, basically. Pooping and peeing and other forms of bodily secretion. So, that's the very low level, right? But at the same time, he's also engaging with very important ideas that have to do with the Athenian democracy of his day. So, what do I mean by that when I talk about that? All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here in the work. I'll come back to the beginning of the work in just a moment. But what we are dealing with here are ideas and approaches to learning and to education, because at the end of the day, that's kind of what the comedy is about: is the education of our sons. And I mean our sons because you know daughters' education were strictly at the discretion of their fathers, um, but not 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 formal. They didn't go to the same schools or anything like that. If your dad was enlightened enough and wealthy enough to have an educated slave, then that slave would teach the daughter to read and write and teach her the classics. And by the classics, I mean things like Homer, Pindar, Bacchylides, those kinds of things. But that was not, I mean, it wasn't unheard of, certainly, it happened, but it wasn't the common practice. It wasn't even an expected practice. Okay. So when we talk about education, we're talking about the education of the sons. And when we talk about the education of the sons, what we're talking about is the future of the city-state itself, the future of the polis. Because the kids who are educated, the young men who are educated because they are expected to take up the purpose of the polis, the purpose of the city-state itself. So how you educate and what you educate is extremely important. Okay. So that's that one of the central themes of the clouds. I would argue probably the central theme of the clouds. Okay, so but the thing about Athens in this time period, beginning around about 470 and going down to about 410 or so, there were a lot of teachers who came to Athens, and not who just came to Athens. Some of them were actually Athenians themselves. Uh, but whether they were Athenians or whether they were these foreign wise men, came to Athens and they set up their schools. Okay, so collectively, these people became known as the Sophists. Singular is the sophist, right? Now, what does this word mean? Well, you can see the soph. The soph is related to our English word philosophy. Sophos is the Greek word for knowledge. But the ist is a different, the ist kind of changes the meaning of the word a little bit. It demeans it. It lessens it. So that if a Sophos is a wise man. The sophistes is simply wise-ish. Now, why did they gain this name? Well, there's two elements to this. The first is that there is an element of automatic traditional Athenian rejection of anything new coming into the city. Remember, Athens, we think of it as as a radical democracy, as indeed it was for a time period. But don't forget, the history of Athens isn't just that 100 years between 500 and 400. It goes back, 300 years, and it's going to stretch, since, forever in the future. Um, but it wasn't always a democracy. Before that, it was a monarchy. They experienced a period of tyrants. They had rule simply by the aristocracy. So there's still a large part of Athenian society that is very traditional in its outlook, and by traditional I mean what nowadays in our modern American political spectrum would filter as conservative. Okay, uh, these people who came to the city. Now remember, part of the birth of democracy was opening the democracy to foreigners coming into the city. So a lot of these foreigners who did come into the city did what they did best to try and make a living. And so these particular people who became known as sophists, they basically set up schools. Okay. Now let me just wrap up here real quick on this idea of the sophists. They were. I'm going to get into them. I'm going to get into individual teachings of individual sophists in just a minute. But it's important to understand that these guys they were never like, you didn't get a ID card that said Sophist Club member number 4 or whatever. You never got that. That was not the case. They taught things that sometimes were radically contradictory to one another. But they all had a few things in common that made them suspicious to the Athenians. First thing that they tended to have in common is that they taught for money. That's not good from a traditional minded Athenian perspective, because money is conveniently, from the people who have money, they can say that money is a corrupting force. Um, and that's what wealthy Athenians said, that when you introduce money into education or politics, you're corrupting the process. And also, too, don't forget, there's no separation here between education and politics. It's supposed to be one continuum. Education is your gateway into the political life. It's not like you graduate from school and then you decide whether you're going to go into politics or not. Every adult male Athenian citizen is expected to participate in one way or another in the political life of Athens. So to put money into the education process is the same thing as putting money into the political process, and that leads to corruption. If you pay somebody to teach you, what are they going to teach you? They're going to teach you what you want to be taught, because they want to get paid. So that was a big no-no as well. Now, then on top of that, you had a number of individual sophists who gained reputations for teaching things that were also, in their same way, non-traditional. A Protagonos, to begin with. Sorry, I'm going to dig my notes out here. Oh, I'm sorry, not Protagonos. See, I knew I misspelled it. Protagoras, sorry. Excuse the scratch out, but his name is Protagoras, who in fact himself was a buddy of Socrates, if we believe the dialogues of Plato. I'll come to that in a minute, a bit later. Protagoras' most famous statement is that man is the measure. Damn it. try this again. Protagoras good. This time I got it on the whole page. Just about. So Protagoras' most famous statement is that man is the measure. Protagoras. When we talk, Protagoras is operating in Athens probably sometime around the 460s, 450s, in that neighborhood. And when the impact of Protagoras' statement that man is the measure, I don't know if you can hear the siren or not, but it's going off, is the import of this statement is that it is generally interpreted, though not universally interpreted, but generally interpreted as meaning that we as humans calculate truth from our own perspectives. Things that we see, the things that we experience, we think of those things as true, and therefore we think of the things that other people have as being untrue. Okay? In other words, to put this in other words, truth is relative. It might be true for you, but that doesn't mean it's true for me. I have a different experience from you. So just because you think it's true doesn't mean it's true for me. And vice versa. You could say to me, well, that might be your truth. And so this is quite a revolutionary statement, because in the tradition of Greek philosophy, the impulse is to arrive at an absolute truth. I'm not going to go into the history of philosophy with you now. I probably would if we were in class, but we're not, so I won't do it here now. But generally, the tendency in Greek philosophy is to come to what Aristotle will later call a telos, T-E-L-O-S in English, telos, which means an end, a goal. Like, you're going to come to the final explanation eventually if you pursue your argument through and through. Aristotle doesn't come to the next century. He's after Protagoras. Don't get the wrong impression with the chronology here. But in any case, in Greek philosophy, the general tradition is always to look for an absolute truth. And so when Protagoras shows up and says, hey, man is the measure of all things, he actually uses the word metron. That's the word for measure. That's where we get our word meter from. A metron is a measuring stick. So we literally measure things from where we can see, or from our own perspective, and that leads to the implication that truth is relative. So that's dangerous and non-traditional. Who else do we have to talk about here? We can talk about a guy by the name of Diagoras. Again, like Protagoras, not a native Athenian. So I'm sorry, the I looks funny, but it's a Diagoras. And what Diagoras has become primarily associated with, none of his work survive, so this is just what other people have said about him, is atheism. Oh no, everyone be scared. Supposedly the claim against Diagoras, so Diagoras' works only exist in references by other writers back to his works. According to one source, Diagoras wrote a work called On the Gods, and the source goes on to say in which he attempted to prove that there were no gods. So it's weird. On the gods, there are no gods. But in any case, Diagoras is associated with atheism. But again, let's contextualize what it means to be an atheist. in Athens versus what it means to be an atheist now. So, I'm an atheist. I can stand up and say that I don't believe there's a God. And when I say that, what I mean is I don't believe there's a central unifying intelligence that sits outside of our sensible universe that plays with it the way a puppeteer plays with things. I don't believe that. Yeah, it's a Tuesday night. Wait till it's a Saturday night. But to an ancient Athenian, you have to remember Athens, and not just Athens, but all of the Greek city-states had patron gods and goddesses, right? So they all had mythologies that linked their political, their civic identity back into a particular god or goddess. And so for Athens, it's Athena and Poseidon. Athena being the goddess of wisdom. The Athenians fancied themselves as particularly clever. They were clever. And then Poseidon, of course, who is the god of the seas. Athenian well-being, economy, existence is founded on the name. So it didn't, you didn't have, to be, so what I'm getting at here is this charge of atheism. It wasn't, you didn't even have to say that no gods exist. That was atheism. But what also was atheism was we just call these gods by these names because it's convenient for us to think of things that help us by God's names. That's also a form of atheism, because you're so fire, or we call fire Hephaestus because we want to attribute the gift of fire to some divine intelligence, right? Or we call wine Dionysus because we want this thing that brings us so much joy must be divine in nature, so let's call it by a god's name, right? So if you try to explain religion that way too, that's also verging on atheism too. Now the thing about this is atheism was punishable by death in ancient Athens. It was a capital crime, because to deny or to undermine the existence of the traditional gods was to deny and undermine the very foundations of the city. If your civic belief is based on Athena and Poseidon, and someone comes out and says there's no Athena or Poseidon, those are just names that we made up, then that in turn potentially serves to undermine the identity of the city itself and the confidence of the city itself. So, it's like hugging the flag on stage, that kind of thing. So we got Protagoras, we got Diagoras. I'm just going to give you one more name here with the Sophists. This guy's name is Prodicus, and he is now primarily associated with his teachings in rhetoric, because Plato wrote a dialogue about him. So Prodicus associated with rhetoric. So these are three things that the Sophists are all associated with. Prodicus claimed to be able to teach you the right way to use words, basically. And what he was teaching you was how to make effective arguments in law courts. So you can see where that ties into the clouds, because that's the whole reason why Strepsiades sends his son Pheidippides off to be educated at the Thinkery itself. In addition to that, there's another trend. Now, this is not strictly speaking related to the Sophists. This goes back a little bit farther in the Greek philosophic tradition, but it's the notion of scientific rationalism. Um, and this is again equally potentially subversive to the city ideals, because under the ideas of scientific rationalism, uh, the trend in scientific rationalism begins with a philosopher called Thales. I'm not going to give you all the names and dates and all that stuff because, frankly, I'm not going to test you on them. So it begins with a philosopher called Thales. Thales is the first guy in the European world, at least, although I'm quite sure this had been going on in lands farther to the east, like Mesopotamia and Syria, etc. But Thales is the first person recorded to be able to accurately predict the occurrence of a solar eclipse. In other words, he studied the data and realized that this was a regularly occurring phenomena and accurately predicted it. There are some sources that say he explained it rather than predicted it, but it doesn't really matter which source is accurate, because the larger point stands, which is that he's offering a rational explanation for things that people previously thought were beyond their ability to grasp. I mean, up to the point of Thales, Greeks thought when the suns disappear, oh my goodness, the gods are mad at us. They took the sun away from our sky. Let's go kill 100 cattle, and then the sun would move away. But they would still kill 100 cattle so that it didn't happen again for a night. See, now I'm embarrassed because I should know the frequency of occurrence of eclipses, but I don't. I don't know, what is it, like 20 years, 23 years, 25 years? I don't know. Somebody, you could email me and let me know. But so what I'm getting at here is looking at the character of Socrates in the Clouds. I already wrote his name down here somewhere, so let me not waste paper. When you look at the character of Socrates and what he teaches at his school, called the Thinkery, usually, that's the most common translation. It's also sometimes called the Think Pot, or other translations, but we're going to, for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to call it the Thinkery. What you see is that what Socrates teaches there is exactly all of the things that all of the sophists that I've been talking about teach, right? So, and even the non-sophists. So he's teaching a form of scientific rationalism, which is to say that when Strepsiades, who's our main character, second main character, I guess Socrates is the main character, when he shows up, Socrates' students are performing experiments. They're dipping fleas in wax and then making them jump, and then so the wax is wet when they put them down, and then when they jump, they make another wax mark, and then they can measure the distance between the wax marks, so they know how far a flea jumps, right? Or they're in a dispute over whether when a little gnat flies through the air, if it goes through its mouth or if it goes through its butt. But it's all about establishing this place. One of the things about this place is that it's engaged in this scientific rationalism, and that sets us on the road towards establishing our version of Socrates. Okay, so let me just show you this real quick. I'm going to throw Socrates in air quotes here, right? Because Socrates in Aristophanes' Clouds is not, in certainly no way meant to be a kind of an accurate biographical portrayal of real life Socrates. He's a character of comedy. Socrates is not the only person in Athens that Aristophanes did this to. There are many, many others that he called by name, or at least made clear by direct implication who it was on stage. And this is how comedy works, right? You exaggerate a person to their greatest extremes. I'll come back to that in a second. But don't take this as this is not real life Socrates. This is uh, um, all of the controversial new teachings that have shown up in Athens rolled up into this figure called Socrates. Why Socrates? I'll come back in that in a second. But another one of these things, just like we saw with Diagoras and his atheism, is that Socrates in the play is also guilty of atheism. Strepsiades says, "Oh, by Zeus," and Socrates says, well, "Zeus? Who's Zeus? There is no Zeus. Those gods don't exist. The only divinities are the clouds," he says. Clouds make everything happen. Sorry, I'm just writing this down so I know to come back to it. So the clouds make everything happen. There's no real gods. They don't exist. Right? So he's an atheist. He's a scientific rationalist. He's an atheist, right? He's also out to teach for money. He demands payment for his education, both from Strepsiades and then later when he teaches his son Pheidippides. He expects to be paid for what he teaches. Okay, again. If we believe Plato and Plato's portrayal of Socrates, that was not true of real-life Socrates. But we'll talk about that down the road. There's a strong argument to be made that Plato's Socrates is every much a literary construct as Aristophanes' Socrates is a literary construct. But we're not ready to talk about that yet. So let's just stick with Aristophanes and understand that this is a caricature of all these ideas that are seen as ridiculous and harmful. And then, of course, the whole reason why Strepsiades wants his son to go to the Thinkery to learn from Socrates is because that rumor has it Socrates can teach you rhetoric. In other words, Socrates can teach you how to construct convincing arguments, irrespective of whether those arguments are correct or incorrect, but just how to convince people. Because Strepsiades is in debt. So let's deal with these two characters here. Strepsiades and his son Pheidippides. So Strepsiades and Pheidippides, right? I shouldn't have to hold it up for too long because you could open your book and find their names out. Strepsiades is the dad. He's a farmer. Now his name means something because this is comedy, and comic poets love to give their made-up characters names that mean things. And what his name means is Mr. Twisty. Why? Because he's trying to twist and turn his way out of his debts. Well, how did he get in debt? He got in debt because of his son, Pheidippides. What does Pheidippides love? Pheidippides loves the horses, which is expensive. Whether you're trying to own them or you're trying to bet on them, you're going to lose money at the end of the day. So Pheidippides, his name means something too. The Phaid part is from his dad's side of the family. That means cheap. Cheap is in the sense of like not wanting to spend money. And the Ippides part of his name, the hippo, that's hippo, is in like hippopotamus. The hippo part is about horse. So his name is funny because it's like straight out of the box. It's self-contradictory, or shall I say oxymoronic. It contradicts itself. Phytos, cheap. Hippos, horses. You can't not have money and do things with horses. Pheidippides' mother. So Strepsiades is a farmer, which doesn't make him poor per se. It doesn't out of the box automatically indicate that he's poor, but it does carry with it some certain characterizations, the same characterizations that we tend to bring with us as when we think of people who live in the countryside, we city dwellers who think of people who live in the countryside now, insofar as they're uneducated. Come back to that in a second. They are suspicious of outside influences. Now, again, these are all stereotypes. I'm not saying any of these things are true. I come from country stock, so I wouldn't do that. But most of all, what we're supposed to think of when we think of Strepsiades as a farmer, and the way city people tend to think of country people in general, is that when country people come to the city, they don't know the score. They're easily taken advantage of. I mean, this is a trope that crops up in many places. I won't give you all the examples of it that I can think of right now. One of them is, I will give you one example. One of them is a song by Stevie Wonder called "Living for the City." And the plot of the song involves a young man who comes out of the countryside to New York City. And he's standing on the street corner, and a guy comes up and gives him, makes friendly talk. And the guy says to him, "Hey, can you just hold this bag for me for 1 second? I got to run around the corner." And the country guy does. And then, of course, the guy runs around the corner. And then what happens next? The cop shows up. And our country guy gets thrown in jail. That's not comedy. I'm not making, it's a great song. I'm just using that as one example. And there are, again, I could talk about Crocodile Dundee, and there's, a zillion examples about the country mouse in the city, and how they can't deal with life. Well, why can't they deal with life? Because they don't know. They don't understand the way of city people, right? Why don't they? Trying to get this on screen. Because they're unsophisticated. They're not clever enough. They don't know all the tricks. They don't know the nuances of all the words that are used. They trust people, right? You will see in the middle of this English word, unsophisticated, where did I put it? The Greek word sophist. That's where it comes from. So what the practice of the sophistics comes to represent is corruption. Corruption because, well, mainly and mostly because they take money for teaching, right? So why is that a big deal? You think, well, teachers get paid today. Well, I might, take you up on that in conversation, but sorry. We do get paid. I'm sorry. That was a joke in poor taste at these times. I already talked about this. Money is seen as corruptive because education is an extension of how you train for your life in politics, holding office, being in public, serving on jury, and so whatever whatever you learn is going to lead to your later character in life, right? So the sophists are seen as a corrupting influence, but that doesn't bother Strepsiades, our main character. He wants his son to go off to the Thinkery because he thinks that at the Thinkery he will learn from Socrates how to argue. In other words, he thinks that he is going to learn rhetoric from Sophocles. And then, excuse me, Pheidippides' son will then be able to come back and argue with the creditors, argue Strepsiades is way out of debt with the creditors. Okay, but Pheidippides is too lazy to go, so Strepsiades goes. This is the first part of the play. When Strepsiades first goes to the thinkery, Socrates is hanging up in a basket, suspended from the ceiling. So Strepsiades doesn't see him. He only sees one of the students who's bent over, and he says, "Hey, you over there? What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm studying geology, but my ass is studying astronomy." So yeah, those are the kind of jokes that you can expect in Aristophanes. I'm not. That's just not me making that up. That's in the text. So eventually Strepsiades finds Socrates. Socrates says, I walk upon the air, and I look down upon the sun." So he makes this grand pronouncement that almost sounds as if he's saying, "I'm above the gods. Like I've transcended the regular notions of immortality, such that I, a mortal, can walk on the air and look down upon the sun." So that of course is a hint towards the characterization of Socrates as an atheist. So I'm going to run through this really quickly so that I can wrap this up within about an hour, because there's still a couple of things I want to talk about. Strepsiades attempts to enroll himself in the school. He proves an unfit applicant. He does not pass his entrance exam. He fails on his language skills because it's been so long since he studied. Because as a farmer, after you learn to read and write, what more do you need? You don't have to learn, much else after that. So he hasn't read anything for a long time. But Homer attempts to quiz him Homer, pardon me. Socrates attempts to quiz him on his Homer. He attempts to find out how well Strepsiades knows all of his different poetic meters. So if you remember me talking about this earlier in the semester, every form of Greek poetic expression was defined by the meter that it used. So tragedy had a meter that it used. Epic had a meter that it used. Elegy had a meter that it used. Lyric had a meter that it used. And so it wasn't so much about the subject matter as it was about the actual technique of it. I've already talked about this a zillion times, so I won't talk about it much more now here. But he tries to test him on his poetic rhythms. And now here I'm going to talk about how I mentioned this earlier, but about Aristophanes. So we're dealing with really high ideas here, right? How do we educate the young people of our city? How do we train them to be the best citizens that they could possibly be so that Athens continues on in its success? And then at the other level, we've got this very low level of humor, right? So I'm going to go to I've talked a little bit about the high end. I'm going to talk a little bit about the low end now. Socrates asked Strepsiades how good he is at reciting Homer. And when he's asking him about how good he is at reciting Homer, what he's asking him is, can you recite dactyls? That's the meter. That's the rhythm, right? So again, this is a thing that you should really already have in your notes back when we talked about Homer. But if you remember when I talked about the dactyl, I talked about it being the long syllable and the two shorts, right? Dactylos means finger, right? So the dactyl is long, short, short, or stressed, unstressed. That's unstressed, stressed, unstressed. Wait, that's three. Yes, stress, unstressed. So something like that, along those lines. But you get the point. So it's long, short, right? But it's the dactylos, or the dactyl. And what Strepsiades answers to Socrates is that, well, I'm not so good anymore. I don't remember much anymore. But when I was a younger man, I was really, really good at the finger rhythm. And that's what he does. That's the joke there, right? So high ideas, low humor. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. Although there's a bazillion Brazilian other answers, examples that I can give. So I'm going to turn now to what happens towards the end of the play. Let me make sure I got the notes that I need out here. Not that I shouldn't even say the end of the play. I'm going to talk about the second half of the play, because the play is really a play of two halves. You have the first half of Strepsiades attempting to get himself enrolled in the Thinkery, unsuccessfully. Then he goes back home, and then when he goes back home, all the actors are off the stage, and then the chorus comes on and occupies the stage. Okay, and they sing a song. They sing their solo song. This is where you get one of the members of the chorus stepping out and saying, "Hey, you didn't give this play first prize first time," you know. So I'm going to pause with my discussion of the clouds as such and just talk about the historical context here. The general scholarly consensus is that this version of the birds was not staged at the time. That Aristophanes wrote it, but it didn't get produced. It didn't actually get staged at the time. Now, obviously, it's been staged, a zillion times since then. But the original version was the one that did make the stage and didn't succeed so very well. So I don't know why that is, but that's just the thing, and it is a thing. So back to the birds. The chorus comes on stage and they sing their extended solo. That's called a parabasis. Don't worry about that word. When you take comedy next spring, we'll get more into detail about that. But what I'm really getting at here is the scene, because eventually Strepsiades is able to get his son to go to the Thinkery. He drags his son Phidippides out of bed and drags him off to the Thinkpot. At which point, Socrates tells us that, well, there are two ways that we can educate people. So here we go back to the idea of moral relativism, right? There's two ways that you can be taught, and both are equally valid. So what they do is they have a contest to see which kind of education will get the money, the tuition fees, to educate Phidippides. Okay. This kind of scene is called an agone scene. So there's a line over the O because that indicates that it's a long O, agone. It's an agone scene. This is where we get our English words agony, agonize from. And this word means a struggle, a confrontation, an argument, a negotiation, bartering, haggling, anything that has to do with you and another person going back and forth with words, sometimes with fists, but usually with words, as trying to persuade each other. It could be political debate. Like I said, it could be arguing about how much you want to pay for a blanket in the market, right? Or it could be somebody stepped on your toes and you want to call them out over it. Those are all agones, right? And then would come to blows. That's also an agone. So it means struggle or competition or confrontation. And it's a common feature in all of Greek drama, both tragedy and comedy. In actual fact, so when we think back to the Prometheus Bound, the Prometheus Bound is more or less one continuous agone scene, except for the part where Io is on stage. That's a little bit more sympathetic, but even then, Prometheus is pretty self-assertive. but certainly the opening scene with might and strength and Hephaestus and versus Prometheus, that's certainly an Agon scene. The scene with Okeanos, Ocean, who's the father of the chorus, who makes an appearance in the play, who also tries to play the good cop and just say, "Oh, well, hey, you know what? Forget about it, man. Just go with it. Go with Zeus. It's okay. Everything will work out later." Um, and of course, Prometheus completely, gives him the stiff arm. Um, uh, that's an Agon scene, and then the final scene with Hermes, right before Prometheus gets blasted with the lightning bolt. That's another Agon scene. Um, but any scenes of argument. So you look at a play like Oedipus the King. We have a couple. We have several. Well, I'll pick out 3 Agon scenes. Oedipus argues with Creon. Oedipus argues with Tiresias, and then Oedipus has to argue with the shepherd at the end of the play to find out the final truth of things. So those are all also Agon scenes. Okay, but it's not just in tragedy; it's also in comedy. So Aristophanes loved his Agon scenes. The majority of plays that survive by Aristophanes end in one kind or another of an Agon scene. He loved them because they have tons of comic potential. So in this Agon scene, what we have an argument is between the worst, what is often translated as worse logic and better logic, or correct logic. It's probably a better word than better. In Greek, the actual phrases are just argument, or I'm sorry, is that the wrong place? Unjust argument, and the just argument. And this is just and unjust in the sense of moral correctness. So it's the Agon scene, and it's the argument between the worst argument and the correct or worst logic and the correct logic, or to put it another way, the unjust argument and the just argument. Okay. So what are the arguments that they put forward? Well, what the unjust argument puts forward, or let me start with the just argument first, because the just argument loses in the end. So let's start with the loser first. What the just argument claims to teach you is moral correctness, morality, the things that are right or wrong in an absolute sense. And what is the basis of morality? The basis of morality are the traditional texts, that the poetic texts that the Greeks have always based their education on, what you learn to read and write out of. So poets like Homer, which you've read, and there's a bunch of other names. I won't put them all on the piece of paper because you're not going to need to know them. I threw Hesiod's name up on there because we'll read him when you take myth. So it's about traditional poetry, right? Things like Homer. That's where a man learns to be a man, right? You learn that through reading the Iliad. You learn you learn proper modes of behavior from reading the Iliad, because these were men's men. These were kings and princes and heroes and lords. That's where we have to look. In other words, what the just argument claims is that by adhering to traditional modes of education, that includes, as I just said, that includes study of the classics, and even by Aristophanes' day, Homer was already a classic, even in the way that we think of it. you can learn proper moral ways to behave, and then you couple that with your physical training, right? You stay fit. You go to the gymnasium every day. This is what in Athenian terms they refer to as or what we translate as music and gymnastic. So music, this top term music, is from the Greek ta musica. It means anything that has to do with the muses. So right when it says when I write the word music, don't think that you're just learning to play the piano or the violin or whatever. But so the muses in myth are 9 daughters of Zeus, each of whom oversees a particular sphere of the arts. There's a muse for tragic poetry. There's a muse for comic poetry. There's a muse for dance. There's a muse for music. There's a muse for history. Like any of the identifiable categories of arts is under the category of the musics or of ta musica. Or of the muses. So when we talk about music in this context, when we talk about this traditional Athenian idea of education, we talk about music, what we're talking about is nowadays what we would, I guess, loosely refer to as a liberal arts education. You got to take a little sciences, you got to take a little English, you got to take a little history, you got to take a little arts, you got to take a little gym class. Like it's this like well-rounded idea, this idea that, perfecting your mind and perfecting your body are part of the same process. That's the very traditional idea, and that's what the just argument or correct logic puts forward. The argument that the unjust argument puts forward is, hey, forget about all that. I'll teach you how to make arguments that make you money. I'll teach you how to win lawsuits. In short, I'll teach you how to make the wrong argument seem like the right argument. Oops. So, what the just argument is, if what the just argument is teaching you is what to argue, that is to say, the moral basis, the moral foundation on which to build your life's view, life's perspective, and therefore the arguments, the persuasive speech that you use in public. It's very much a what thing because there's a what there, like what is right? The worse argument is simply teaching you not what to argue, but rather how to argue. This one is saying there is an absolute right or wrong. This one is saying, it's only about what you can get away with. It's only about what you can convince people of. That's all that matters. As long as you walk away with a few dollars in your pocket, that's all that matters. And the wrong argument, of course, wins and educates Pheidippides. Um, so I'm going to wrap this up momentarily here. Uh, there's at least one other funny episode I want to talk about real quick, which is the um, what happens with Pheidippides when he returns home with his brand new education, his brand shiny new education. Now, remember, the point of Strepsiades sending his son off to the school was so that his son would come back and get his dad out of debt. But that's, of course, not what ends up happening, hilariously, as this is comedy. Um, and So Pheidippides comes back, and Strepsiades is like, "Oh, well, are you going to help me now?" Pheidippides is like, "No, I'm not going to help you." And Strepsiades, the dad, is like, "Well, why won't you help me?" And Pheidippides, the son, says, "Well, because you hit me when I was a kid, right? You spanked me when I was a child, basically." And Strepsiades says, "Well, I only spanked you because I loved you, um, and I wanted you to grow up a stronger man. Like I wanted you to grow up a better person. So I only spanked you because I loved you, right?" At which point Pheidippides says to his dad, um, "Doesn't it say in Homer that uh, grown men are just young boys but bigger?" He actually quotes the line from Homer. It does say that, and he quotes the line out of Homer that says that. And Strepsiades, of course, is forced to admit it. Yes, it does. It says that. And then Pheidippides says, "So if you're just a little boy that's bigger, but you hit me when I was a little boy because you loved me, then I love you too." And he smacks his dad, which is funny because obviously, that's a taboo. And there's comedy works on breaking taboos, but that's a different conversation for another day. Um, and then, of course, Pheidippides turns around and says, "Hey, where's mom? I love her too." This is even more shocking. But the point of that whole thing is that's an illustration of sophistry, right? You're taking a set of words and you're making them mean the opposite of what they were originally in their context intended to mean. So you're taking the right argument and you're turning it wrong, or you're taking a bad argument and you're making it seem as if it's right. So it's about manipulation of words, and it's about rhetoric, which is sorry, I don't mean to get my back up here. Which is something that you probably should be paying attention to as as we go through this summer into this autumn. But the very last thing that I'll talk about here is the chorus, and they are the clouds. And I promise this will be over real quick. Because it's 9 o'clock and I'm starving. So the clouds. Why the clouds? Why does Aristophanes choose the clouds as his chorus? What? So he says there are no gods; it's only the clouds. There's a funny thing. There's a whole funny description about how, like, well, Zeus makes it thunder and lightning and rain, and Socrates is like, "You think Zeus is just peeing on us when it rains? That's not what happens." And he explains it in terms of currents of hot and warm air moving around, which is kudos to Aristophanes. It proves that he knew something about the scientific and philosophical theories of his day. Um, so, yeah. But in any case, again, this goes back to the idea of scientific rationalism. We already talked about that. Leave that aside. So the whole world is one. Basically, what Socrates is saying is the whole world is one big oven, where hot air and cold air just circulate around. But why would he substitute clouds for the gods? There's in other of Aristophanes' plays, his choruses are birds, they're frogs, there are many weird and wonderful things that Aristophanes draws on for his choruses. So why hear the clouds? Because my argument is that the clouds are representative of the general traditional Athenian ideas about sophistry, or the sophists, or sophism. Okay? How are the clouds symbolic of sophistry? Number one, the clouds are insubstantial. You can't hug a cloud, right? When you fly in a plane and your plane goes up and you hit a cloud, it's not as if the plane crashes; it goes right through it. They're vapor, right? So the clouds themselves they're insubstantial, right? And so this functions as a symbol of sophistic argument, because what teachers like Prodicus claim to be able to teach you is to be able to make words fit the circumstances, right? And what the bad argument, the worse argument, the unjust argument claims to teach you is how to manipulate words to make money, right? So, like, think about this for a second. When you go to law school, you don't go to law. When you get to law school, you're not taught how to defend the innocent and prosecute the guilty. You're taught how to make the best case for your client, right? And that's a bit like what's going on here. With I know there are many lawyers who do many great things, so I'm not dissing all lawyers out of hand, low hanging fruit. Um, but the point here I'm making is that the point Aristophanes is trying to make is that as just the arguments of the use of rhetoric is as insubstantial as the clouds are, as the fog is, as the mist is, right? That's how much concreteness it has to it, right? And you can't forget that Athens and traditionally Athenian political life depends on persuasive speech. Like, you go to the assembly and you have to be able to argue your case. You have to be able to convince other people to vote for the thing that you're putting forward, the law that you're putting forward, the policy that you're putting forward, whatever it is. And so, like, right and wrong kind of traditionally matters in Athens. So they're insubstantial, and at the same time, I'm going to put this in one word. They're totally malleable. I guess this is kind of redundant in a manner of speaking. They're insubstantial in the sense that there is no core meaning to them. They are malleable in the sense that the word malleable means to be bendable, be shapeable, be fashionable. So, like, clay is a malleable thing, right? It comes from the Latin word malleus, which is a hammer. So it means it can be hammered into shape. So malleable means, shapeable, right? Which means it can change shapes. And that's, again, going back to the ideas of sophistry and sophistic argument. You can argue whatever you want with them, because you're not learning a set of core technique, or you're not. I'm sorry, excuse me, I got that completely 100% wrong. You're not learning a core value system. What you're learning is a set of techniques that can be equally applied to any value system that you come across, which is what we call moral relativism, which is one of the things that the sophists introduced into Athens in the 450s, 440s. And that's what Aristophanes is talking about in the clouds. That's his high idea. How are we going to pursue the education of our kids? Lots of low jokes. I spared you by recounting all of them. I did some of them. But yeah, so that's all I have to say. Have a good night and bye.